Heather from the World Bank, and today we're going to be continuing our knitting videos, and we're going to cover a couple, one major topic, but different ways you can do the same thing, and that is knitting in the round. Up until this point, we've kind of we've, no pun intended, worked around knitting in the round by knitting flat totally. So we've used, in our prior sample, we knit this flat, so we were knitting back and forth the whole time, but then seamed it on one side. So we have a bit of a seam showing. It's not ideal because we had to increase and decrease stitches while we were knitting diagonally. So there's a bit of an uneven edge you can kind of see here. And then also the seam is really visible and you might not want that. So there's a way to fix this. And so up until this point, you call it knitting flat, but what we're going to be doing today is knitting in the round, and there's a couple options for that. In prior olden days, you would be knitting with what is called double pointed needles. So here's an example of that. They usually come in sets of like 4 or 5, and they, as it's described, they have 2 points on either end, double pointed needles. So you can knit with each side basically, and that's different than a standard straight needle, which is cut off on one side and only has the point on the other side. So back in time when our grandmothers were knitting and everything, they didn't really sell what is called circular needles, which are a lot easier, but they had wooden double pointed needles, which you can create basically a circle with when you hold them in, a square formation, or if you had less stitches, it could be a triangular formation, and you can see the circle there, but it's just a little bit messy looking. It's kind of hard to hold them all at the same time, and I'll get into more of the details on how you knit with these 4 needles at once, but this is how you would make a circle before circular needles existed. So now we have what is called circular needles, and here's an example of a project I started. It's a hat, and I've been knitting in the round the whole time, and this is just on a circular needle, and you just go in a cylinder over and over again. There's no breaks, there's no gaps, and then you just have a marker for the beginning of the round to kind of keep track of your rounds, but we'll go into that in a bit more detail as well. But overall, you have 2 options, which is the double pointed needles I showed you, or a circular needle here. And circular needles are really unique because they come in different lengths. You can see this one's really long. There's also, a couple examples here. This one is a bit more medium size. The one I'm using for my hat is, a standard 16-inch one. That's typically what you would use for a hat. And then you can use really tiny ones, like this one is meant for a sock. This one's only 9 inches. They're kind of hard for me to use too. I almost prefer the double points because it's so tiny to work with, but it is an option as well if you're doing a really small circumference. So yeah, and then the other benefit of circular needles is that you can also use them to knit flat. You don't just have to knit in a circle. If you have a really long cord here, you can, instead of using straight needles like this, you can tell that, this is a lot more distance than the straight needle, where you would have to fit all your stitches on this, but you could fit like, more than 100 stitches of like a decent sized, yarn on this cord. And instead of like making a circle, you just basically knit down one side, then turn your work, and then knit down the other side. So that's an option for knitting flat, even though you're using circular needles, and it gives you a lot more flexibility with like how many stitches you can have on your needles at one time. So a lot of knitters will recommend buying circular needles with these interchangeable cords because they can do a lot of things. They can do small circumference knitting like hats or some sleeves, and they can also do really big projects like a sweater. So the interchangeable aspect is when you can unscrew the tip of the needle like this, and then you have the cord here, and I could put any size cord on this. I could put a smaller cord for a hat or a bigger cord if I was working on a shawl or a sweater, which would be something like this. So that's one option. And then it's easier to change sizes when you're knitting during a project as well. Like say you have to go down a needle size to do the cuffs of your sleeves or something, or the bottom of a sweater and they want you to go down a needle size so it's tighter. You could easily switch the tips without having to like totally knit a row onto another set of needles, if that makes sense. I'm going to get started with showing you how to, begin knitting in the round on double pointed needles, and we have another sample too I can show you how to do it on as well. And to begin with, you have to cast on a certain number of stitches onto one double pointed needle. So this is just one of these sets that we have, and we cast it on 60 stitches, and then you'll want to divide them up into relatively even portions. So if you're using 4 double pointed needles, we're going to go with about 15 to split it up, so 15 on each needle. And then if you were going to use 3 double points, it would be more like 20 for each needle. So it's a little more cramped. So it's really up to you and like what's easier for you to hold, basically, because sometimes it's easier to hold the triangle for me, honestly, but then holding a square shape might be easier for other people. Whichever works best. So to get started, you cast on your stitches like normal. We have this all set up already. And then you just start knitting from one side with one of your spare double points. And we have a couple extra still. The set comes with, 5. So you have 5 to work with in this case. So we start with 1 and the one that we cast it on with. And I'm just going to do straight knitting for this example. So I've knit 2 stitches, 3 stitches, and just like normal we go into the first leg, wrap around and pull through. So now we're at 4. I'm just going to go ahead until I get to about 15, until I get to 15. Will always vary depending how many stitches you cast on. So 10, 11, and 15. So I just did my 15th stitch. And then I have the rest of my unworked stitches over here. We don't want to add any more to this needle. This needle is we want to ignore it. So we kind of don't want anything to slide off, so I'm going to move it towards the middle. And then this is where it gets kind of tricky, but you take a new double point, so one that has nothing on it, and we're going to just start working the next batch of 15 stitches. So we're just going to start working the next batch of 15 stitches here. Leave these completely alone like they're not there. So I stick the needle into the front leg of the left stitch, then wrap the yarn around and pull through like normal. So it's tricky, just don't get your yarn mixed up with this extra needle. I'll show that one again just to show you. I'm kind of keeping my yarn in the back, putting my needle through the first stitch, and then wrapping this around without interfering with my extra needle. So we're only wanting to work with this needle that has no stitches on it right now. And now we have our first stitch on there. And you could see a seamless transition, nothing weird looking there. You would see maybe like something wrapped around this needle if you got it mixed in there, but we're pretty good. So we did our first one, and then you continue to knit like normal until we have 15 stitches on our second double pointed needle. And again, my initial needle over here is just kind of dangling. It should stay there by itself without falling off. And 15, our last one. So there we go. We have another set of 15 stitches. It's connected to this one. And we're going to do the same process one more time to get, I'm going to move this to the middle. take another new needle here that has nothing on it. And just like before, now I'm going to ignore both of these two and start working into the remaining stitches on the left. So I put my needle into the first stitch. Try not to wrap around that needle, but we're going to go into our working needle. Pull through. And that's our first stitch, and we'll do 15 more. Or 14 more till we get to 15. Pause here real quick because you'll see things are starting to get a little twisty. So I'm getting my yarn mixed up here. I'm going to kind of pull that out. And then what you don't want to have happen is have any of these kind of twist on each other, or else you're going to mess up your round. I forget what it's called. It gets looped around itself and it doesn't look like a circle anymore. But so you don't want them to start twisting like that. You want to try and keep it. So the trick I've learned is that you want to keep the edge of your work facing you, so you can see all the end stitches and they're all facing you, so you know nothing is twisted. And you'll kind of be able to tell when something is off. So now, before I start dropping any of these, I'm going to put everything kind of in the middle. I'm going to do that over there too. And then it is helpful to have a surface. You can lie everything down. And now you can kind of see what we've been doing, in that we have a nice, what will be a circle, but right now it looks like a square. So right now they're not connected. They're all on separate needles, and this is still a flat piece of work. The working yarn's still over here, but we want to join right here. So we're going to knit these stitches real quick. So we're still using a fresh needle, but once this all comes out, you're going to have an extra needle here basically, and that's what you're going to use for the rest of this. So there we are. So again, we're kind of getting a little twisted. And to avoid that, we want to look at everything so that the ends of every row is facing up, where you could see the ends of all the stitches you've started. So that's helpful. Say it was like that. That's, you're starting to get twisted. If this was all the way turned around, you can see how like this whole area looks wrong. You want everything to be connected and facing you, and that's a good way to tell that you're not twisting anything. So that once you join in the round, it won't be a problem, but you want to just make sure everything is all set before you join in the round, or else it'll mess up your whole project and you'll have to start over. Here we are where we've got all of our stitches cast on, and they've all been evenly distributed on the double pointed needles. So we have 15 on each needle for 60 stitches total. Now we want to join in the round to make our circle that we're going to knit in for this project. Typically what I do, I know there's multiple ways as with a lot of knitting techniques, but I will switch the first and the last stitch from one needle to another. So to begin, I'm going to move one stitch over from my left needle. This is the first stitch I cast on, but I'm going to move it over to the right. And then I'll move my working yarn, this last stitch I cast on right here, up and over the last stitch. Splitting a bit, but there we go. So you see they crossed over each other, but I don't want to drop either of them. So now I want to push them back on the needles, kind of tighten everything up. And then you see how my working yarn is kind of stuck in the front here. To fix that, I'm going to turn my whole project And now my working yarn's in the back again. It is, you know, it's good there, so we can keep going, and we will use our spare double pointed needle to continue, because that, if you were just going to start knitting with this needle, then you'd start moving all these stitches onto the right needle, and then you'd have, you know, 30 stitches on one needle, which isn't what you want. You want to have 15 evenly split up. So to do that, you use your spare needle as your working needle whenever you hit the end of one of these like divided rows. So I'll show you that. So we have our spare needle again. We're going to knit like normal into the first stitch. And then we're going to keep going. And you can see why it's a little hard to hold when you're doing this, but you get used to it. So you want to mind all the other needles too. Make sure you're not losing any stitches when you're going through. And reach the end of that 15 stitch grouping. You just knit the last stitch like normal, drop it off, and then you have another free needle again that you've opened up once you knit that row. So you just continue like that, where you knit down a section with your spare needle and then use the free needle to keep going over and over again. Okay, so we've just finished going all the way through this series of needles, using our spare needle and knitting across each of the 4 we have set up here. And I have my working yarn here, and then this was my tail. So this is a good marker of the beginning of the round of knitting on double points, otherwise it's hard to tell. But basically the beginning of your round in this case is going to be in between these 2 needles, and you can tell because your tail is here. So that's a good marker. And then, as I mentioned, you just continue going in a circle, and this is how you could knit something in small circumference with double points. We're going to show you on a circular needle now. If you don't like the look of double points, you could use circular needles pretty much for everything. Double points do come in handy when you're finishing a hat and it's a really small circumference, or if you're doing a sock, the toe of a sock will be really small also, and you kind of have to use double points in order to get that small of a circumference. But say you're knitting a hat, you get to the very top and you have a few amount of stitches, it usually calls for you to switch to double points at that point. So that is an example there of using double points to knit in the round, but we can also use a circular needle. So here we just cast on a certain number of stitches to pretty much the length of your circular needle, and we're going to, but your pattern may call for anything basically. And the only kind of difference of, you know, knitting flat here again is that we have to join in the round. So if you want to knit flat on these needles, it would be easy. All you'd have to do is turn your work and then start knitting backwards, back the way that you came. But since we're going to be knitting in the round, we want to join again like we did on our double points. So to do that, we want to make sure we're not twisted up here. And to do that, I turn all the bumps on the edge of my work towards me to just make sure everything looks good. And in this case, I have all my kind of working yarn and my tail on this side, and I'm going to move that stitch from my left needle to the right needle, and then I'll move this stitch, the second one, in over to my left needle without dropping that other end stitch. So you kind of pull it through, and you can see how they've crossed over each other. It's kind of easy to see with the different colors, which is good. So now I've joined in the round here, and you can see that all my stitches are connected. I'm going to pull everything kind of tight. I'm going to get my tail out of here. And then in order to see where the beginning of your round is when you're knitting on circular needles, you have to use a stitch marker. So on my hat sample here, you can see I already have one in here. That's the beginning of my round, and that's how I know how many rows I've knit, because you can keep track once you hit the end and like put it on a little a row counter. But yeah, so you'll need to know where the beginning of your round is, especially when you start to do decreases or any sort of pattern that's not your standard pattern. Like this is just a ribbing, but eventually we'll start doing decreases, and then you need to know when the start of your round is. So to do that, you just take a stitch marker. I have a couple here, and you put it on to the right needle before you start working. And then this one's actually a little big here, so I'm gonna switch just because I have really tiny needles. So you put that on there, and then you just continue working like normal, and I'm going to knit into the first stitch here. And these are really tiny needles, so it's a little difficult, but I have my working yarn, wrap it around, and pull it through there, and then drop that stitch. And now you can see we have joined. This is the beginning of our round, and you just keep knitting in pattern all the way through this row. So I'll meet you at the end of the row, and you'll know that once you hit your little stitch marker here. 1, 2, 3. Okay. So I'm at the last couple stitches here. You can see my marker is coming up on the left side now. So I'm gonna do my last 2 stitches, and then you get to your stitch marker, and all you want to do is move it from one side to the other. You want to keep it in between these 2 stitches, but you pass it over to your right needle, and then you can just keep going. So now I know I've completed 1 row since I passed my stitch marker. If you're following a pattern, you might want to mark that down on your pattern. You finished that row. Otherwise, you can just keep going and count your rows later. It'll change as you develop your knitting habits, but this is easy now because you're just going to go in a circle over and over. You're really going in kind of like a cylindrical shape. So you can see how now I have 1 more row on this side than the other side. It looks like a little bit uneven just because you're starting a new row here, but you only have 1 row on that side. So yeah, you just keep going, and then you may have to switch to double points if you had a bigger circle here once you get to a smaller circumference. But otherwise, circular needles are really great in that you just don't have to think about holding all these needles, and you're just going around and around in a circle. Okay, so we've gone through a couple of different options for knitting in the round. We have our double points, we have our circular. This is a small circular, but you can also have like a 16-inch larger like this, good for a hat, or even longer as we showed you. And you can use it for knitting straight in this case, or a really big circumference if you're doing a sweater. Lots of good uses for circular needles. I even have some examples here of double points that can be in all different sizes. So these are all, good methods to avoid having seams on your work like we did in our last project. So instead of sewing this together at the end, you're just knitting in a circle as you go, rather than knitting a flat piece of work and then sewing it together. And then when you think about it, most of your garments that you're making are circular anyway, like a hat or a sweater or socks. Most of those are gonna require knitting in the round, so it's good to have options to know which one is most useful in different scenarios. And then maybe to save money too, even getting a pair of like a set of circular needles that's interchangeable. You can use them for so many things, and it's really popular nowadays to use the circular needles. So you have options. There's a bunch of different ways for doing it. Some people have different preferences, so I'm glad we got to show you all of them today, and we'll see you in the next video.